Anyway, so let me share my screen. There's a handout for the class, which is this one right here. I'm going to go over a little bit of review of what we covered in last week's class. So we started talking about the next project, which is the poster project. And as part of that, remember that the focus is really on typography. So we looked at the type tools and the character panel. I can't remember. I know we've done designing letter forms with the grid. I can't remember if we did the creating the type hybrid type. And I don't think we got as far as doing styles. So is that correct?
So that's good. We didn't go over the hybrid yet.
We didn't go over the hybrid. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. And then I'm also going to look at some ways that you can choose fonts. So there are filters that you can use to choose your fonts. So for instance, you can search for fonts within the fonts that you have loaded. You can search by sans serif, serif, and so on. And then we'll also take a look at how you could activate additional fonts if you want to. I also want to look at the use of hierarchy. So I've set up a file to sort of talk about this a little bit, and then we'll talk in relation to that to blocked type. Hand-drawn lettering as an option. I just really wanted to talk about this as an option for doing your lettering, because people tend to think that, you know, lettering has to be a font, but of course it doesn't necessarily have to be. You could make letters out of spaghetti letters, or you could make letters out of just drawing letter form. And then creating or choosing spot colors. One of the requirements for this next project is that you're going to do these 3 parts, right? So there's the design of the poster, which is 11 by 17, and that'll be in CMYK. The next part is a 1080 by 1080 square for Instagram, which would be in RGB. And then the last version is a t-shirt design, which is going to use what are called 3 spot colors. So this gives us an opportunity to talk about color a little bit. And we'll talk about this in more detail in next week's class, but we'll start talking about this a little bit. And one of the things I wanted to go over is how you choose spot colors. So whether you're choosing spot colors from the Pantone system, which is the most common way of doing it, or you're creating additional spot colors, you would do it. I'll go over how to go about doing that. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is that because on the Instagram one, there is the possibility with the Instagram ad that you could have it be animated, or you could do multiple slides. So remember that these 3 ways of presenting this information, they're not 3 completely different designs. They're really one design, but you're putting them in 3 different ways, right? So one of them is a poster, one of them is an Instagram ad, and one of them is a t-shirt design. So they may vary a little bit, but they should feel like they belong together as part of the same promotional campaign. And there should be a relationship in terms of the typography and the layout and the color and so on. But they can vary. And one of the differences between the different formats is the way that we perceive it, you know, the physical way that we interact with it. And so we want to think about that. If you start off by designing the poster, when you do the Instagram one, the difference is that, first of all, it's going to be a square. Now, I realize that in Instagram you can do rectangles, but for the purpose of this assignment, I'm restricting it. It has to be a square. And so I lost you all of a sudden. Are you all still there? That's weird. All faces all disappeared. That was weird. Back into him. So on the Instagram one, for instance, you could have a video instead of an image. And so you could make like a little animation. And so I was going to show you how in Illustrator, in today's class, I was going to do 2 demonstrations. One of them is how to make how to make an animation with a blend. So the blend basically operates in the same way that a tween would operate in a program like Animate, or what used to be called Flash. And it basically takes you from one point to another, and the computer does all the frames in between. So in Illustrator, you can use the blend tool in a similar kind of way. I'm also going to show you how to create a frame-by-frame animation from Illustrator. And then, like I said, I'll go over creating the spot colors. So in today's class, I'm going to do those 2 animation demonstrations, animation with a blend and then frame-by-frame animation. I'll begin by talking about typography. So we had looked at the various type tools. I'm not going to go into this as much detail as I did in last week's class, but I just wanted to refresh your memories a little bit. So we talked about the three different tools here. This is the tool you're going to use the most, the type tool. And the type tool in Illustrator allows you to create type objects in two ways. Either click and then type something. So if you want to do a small piece of type, like you're creating a logo or a headline or something like that, you might do it like that. And when you select it, you'll see that there's just a line underneath with an anchor point at the beginning. This is because it's left aligned. If I centered it, Shift-Command-C is the keyboard shortcut to center type. That's whether you're in Illustrator, Photoshop, InDesign, whatever. Shift-Command-L is left aligned. Shift-Command-C is centered. Shift-Command-R is right aligned. And Shift-Command-J is what's called justified with last line left aligned. That's a difficult thing to say. I always have to brace myself for that sentence. All right, so that's the first tool, the type tool. You can also click and drag out actually with that tool, and it'll fill it with placeholder text. So if you have an area where you're going to put body copy or a large area of text, it's better if it's contained within a container rather than you typing a line and then hitting return and typing a line and hitting a return. Because if I want to change the size of the text box, I can just use the direct selection tool and drag this in. And now I've got a smaller text box. I don't have to keep taking out the returns and adding new returns. So I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with that concept. The area type tool, I don't use this very much, but it allows you to put type into any shape. So let's say I had a circle, for instance, and I wanted to put type into there. I can choose the area type tool, click on the top left-hand corner, and then it'll fill it with text, and I could add whatever text I wanted into there. And then the type on a path tool, we had done a demonstration, I think, in the class. Did I do a demonstration with you where we make something kind of like a Starbucks logo, or the old Starbucks logo?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Basically, the idea of that, I'm not going to do that demonstration again because it takes a little while and I want to move on to new things. But basically, if you want to put type around an object, you can start off by drawing a circle and then you can type into it. And then you can format the type. So for instance, here it would be better if it was capitals for this style. So I'm going to change it to uppercase. I can change the size in the character panel. I can also adjust the leading, although the leading for this would be pretty irrelevant. I could adjust the kerning, which is the space between two individual characters, and I could adjust the tracking. So here I'm going to adjust the tracking out a little bit. I also want it to be centered, and then I'll go right up to the top. So if I drag this handle right here at the bottom, in the middle of this piece of type, these two at the top here, if you drag them open, you can see that these close and open where the type is. If I keep going, eventually I'd close them up altogether. But by default, these ones are right at the very top. And then you have this one in the middle where you can drag the type. Sometimes that's kind of tricky. So if you're having a hard time finding the handle or dragging it and making it stay in the right position, you see I dragged it here and it snaps back down to the bottom. So I've done this for years and I find it fiddly sometimes. If you want to rotate it another way, you could just simply rotate the entire object. So this would be 180 degrees, actually. And then for the second piece of type, I had drawn a circle in the center and it touches the cap height. So that way, when you do the type on a path, this time, if I drag it down to the bottom and drag it inside, so I literally just drag it inside, drag my cursor up into this circle, and then I can have it be on the inside of the circle at the bottom. So because I've made this circle the same height as the cap height, it ends up fitting to the same position as the other one. All right. The next three type tools, the vertical type tool, the vertical area type tool, and the vertical type path tool. These tools replicate the first three, but for the Japanese version. So if you're doing vertical style typing, then these tools will be useful for you. Occasionally, they might be useful even if you're doing English language or some other language which uses like a similar kind of alphabet. But you might occasionally, just as a kind of like stylistic thing, have vertical type, but it isn't a very easy way to read type. So I think I'd probably shown you this where motel signs are often done vertically, but we can read those pretty easily because first of all, it's a very short word. It's also in context. So you're seeing the sign on the outside of a motel, which looks like a motel. So it's pretty easy to understand what it's saying without really having to read it too much. But generally speaking, vertical type is not easy for us to read. You'll notice on the side of books, if you haven't noticed this before, take a look at books. They don't do vertical type on the spine. What they'll do is take that piece of type and rotate it like this. So if you're laying out a book, the title would be typed like that. It's still easier to read it like this than to have vertical type because what we're actually reading is the shape of the letter forms. To a large extent, when we understand a piece of type, what we're looking at is this shape here is somewhat unique to this word. So it may not be completely unique to it. There's similar shapes with other words, but it limits it down to words that occupy that type of shape. And then, of course, we read the first letter, we read the last letter, and we kind of fudge what's in the middle. The last of these type tools is the touch type tool, which again, I'd suggested that for my own personal purposes, I don't find it particularly useful, but I'll show it to you because we all work differently and you might find it very useful. So this is a way for you to move individual characters around separately. So I can drag this one here, I can drag this one here. We can also do things like if I put my cursor over the top circle, I can rotate it a little bit. So if you wanted the type to feel like it's kind of dancing, because typography is an interesting art form because it's very practical in many ways. It's a way for you to communicate with type, right? It allows people to be able to understand what's being said in a clear and concise way. But it also can be very creative. So with typography, you can make meaning out of the way that the type is presented, as well as the actual words that are being said. So by adjusting the type in this way, you can also scale them. So if you go to the top left-hand corner, this will scale the piece of type proportionally. And if I go to the other side, I can scale it disproportionately, meaning I can either squash it or stretch it. So that's the touch type tool. If you have a computer that has a touch screen, by the way, you can actually use your fingers and grab the type if you have that tool chosen and just scale it that way also. So those are the tools. Then we look to the character panel. The character panel, by the way, is also accessible if you have type selected. So like if I select this piece of type, you'll notice at the top here in the control bar that I have everything to do with character. So if I click here, I can also just access the character panel, but we have the font, the size of the type, and so on. So it doesn't have all of the detail, but it has a lot of it. It also has some stuff like for the paragraph panel. So the alignment settings, left aligned, centered, right aligned, justified, and so on. So both of these are the same thing. This here, which I access by going to Window, Type, and Character, or Command T, or Control T on a PC. Or you can also access it. If you have a piece of type, because this bar at the top, this control bar, is what's called context sensitive. So it depends on what you have selected as to what appears up here. So if you have a piece of type selected, you can also access the character panel from here. If I don't have a piece of type selected, then obviously that's not available. It just suddenly cut out. Were you guys still there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you cut out.
I cut out?
Yeah,
How long ago did I cut out?
2 minutes.
probably 3 seconds.
Oh,
Oh, really?
1 minute.
It was just like a little pause.
Yeah.
Let me try sharing my screen again. It suddenly cut out of sharing my screen. I don't know why.
I disconnected completely.
You disconnected and then you had to come back in?
Yeah, weird.
Yesterday, my girlfriend teaches at Orange Coast College, and yesterday she said that she was doing a lecture and it cut out, but she didn't realize that it cut out. So she did an entire lecture on the history of graphic design for an hour, and the students were all sitting there on their own, like just waiting.
Did she at least record the lesson?
I don't remember. Yeah, I think she did. I think she did record it. Yeah, but
Oh.
but she ended up redoing it because they were all still waiting when she came back. But she'd gone. There was a slideshow of lectures about the history of graphic design. So she said there was 90 some odd slides in the lecture, and she'd got to somewhere like 70 something.
Oh my goodness.
And then she realized that no one was there. All right. Okay, back to this. So you're all here now, right?
Yes.
And you can all see my screen again?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So just to recap the character panel a little bit more. In the character panel, we've got the size of the type. You notice that if I put my cursor over one of these icons, it tells me what it does. So set the font size, set the leading, set the kerning, and set the tracking. So somebody explain to me what the leading is. Give me a description of what leading is. Michelle, have you got any ideas what leading is?
The a distance between baselines.
Yes, very good. So it's the distance between lines of text, and it is measured from baseline to baseline. So let me go back to sharing. So when you measure the leading, what you're measuring it has to be where you've got multiple lines of text. So if I drag this out, you can see now that I've got multiple lines. Let me drag it a little bit bigger, actually. So the measurement of your leading is going from, say, here, which is the baseline of that letter, those letters, to the baseline of those letters. That's what the measurement is based off of, okay? And this is showing up here. So it ends up, effectively, it's the space here that we end up controlling by adjusting the leading, right? So if I select this piece of type and then make the leading greater, we'd have more space between. And if I reduce the leading, we'd have less space between. You can also use the keyboard shortcut, Option or Alt if you're on a PC, and then the up arrow will bring them closer together, and the down arrow will bring them further apart. You can also use this same kind of idea by holding Option or Alt and then using the right and left arrow to adjust the spacing. So you can bring the letters closer together, a little bit too close there maybe, and then you can also have them spaced further apart. So what is that referring to? When I do Option and I use these left and right arrows to adjust, what am I adjusting?
Would be the tracking.
Yeah, you're adjusting the tracking, exactly. So the tracking is the space between characters over some kind of distance, like either a word or a sentence or a paragraph or what have you. What is that same adjustment if it's just between two characters? So let's say I do Option arrow here and just adjust those two characters. What is that term?
Kerning?
Kerning, very good, yeah. So you would do kerning on generally on large pieces of type, not on body copy, but on like a headline or something like that. You would go into a piece of type, and you might especially have to do this if you're using cheap fonts or free fonts that you found online that are not professionally made. Because professionally made fonts, they should by definition have a certain amount of what's called hinting, which is where the designer designs the typefaces so there are these kerning pairs which are automatically adjusted. So when a Y and an O are next to each other, there's a particular kerning setting automatically. So on this one, for instance, if I go through these letters, this second letter, the O and the R, you'll notice is it's set to -40. This one is set to -40. This one is set to 0.
No, it's not a sharing. We cannot see.
Oh, I'm sorry. So on the, going back to this again, on the kerning, if I put my cursor between these two first letters and I look in the character panel, you can see that the kerning is 0. And if I use the arrow to nudge over to the next space, this is set to -40. I haven't adjusted this. This is just the default setting for this particular font. If I set it to 0, this is what the kerning looks like now. So you can see that you get bigger gaps between certain letters than other letters when it's set to 0. So the idea of adjusting this spacing between them is so that we end up, let's set this back to 0 as well. So this font actually has pretty good kerning already. Even when it's set to 0, it doesn't make a massive difference. But certain fonts will give you big spaces between. So basically what you're going, putting your cursor in between two letter forms and then adjusting the space between so that basically, visually at least, when you look at them, there is a similar amount of volume between all of the letter forms.
Professor, I have a question.
Sure.
Is there a certain number when it comes to typography, how much kerning you should do between?
There isn't a certain number because it depends on the font and it
Okay.
depends on the given situation.
Okay.
But generally speaking, if you're talking about tracking, which is a little easier to talk about, where you're over distance, you wouldn't want to track back. So tightening up the tracking, you wouldn't want to track it in more than about -30 at the very most.
Okay.
So -20, -25 is okay. -30 is sort of pushing it actually a little bit. But you can usually get away with that. And again, it depends a little bit on the font, but that's a good rule of thumb to stick to. Don't go. There have been times when I've used tracking which is less than -30, like -40 or something like that. But usually in very specific situations. So, for instance, one of the things I've done in the past is I had a client who was a realtor, and they used to do a back page newspaper ad in the Los Feliz Ledger, which is a sort of local newspaper. And it was a bunch of images of different houses that they'd sold or were available. And then each one would have a listing underneath, and it would have a little bit of text. And because they always wanted to put as much text in as possible, I would always end up having to kind of like tighten up the tracking really close as I could possibly get it to make it fit. But that was only because they were too unwilling to kind of cut the text down a little bit more. I think, to be honest with you, for them, it would have been better if they tried to edit the text slightly more. And I talked to them about that, but they disagreed with me, and you know, they're clients, so they're paying. But it does end up looking quite squashed when you do that. But in that context, you could kind of get away with it. You can read it, you know, and it's fine. All right, let me share my screen again. So one of the other things that I'd looked at, oh, actually, I'm sorry, I didn't quite finish with the character panel. So those are the important things to understand with typography, is that adjustment of spacing. It's a kind of invisible thing that most people don't notice, but it makes a big difference on a piece of design. If you go in and take the time to kern large pieces of type and really think about the spacing between the lines of text and the spacing between the characters, it can make a big difference on a piece of design. Underneath that, you have two settings, vertical scale and horizontal scale, which you should really almost never use. So like anything, there's always exceptions to the rule, but the idea of squashing type is generally frowned upon in typography. So if you take a letter form and you squash it, what you're doing is you're destroying the proportions that the type designer has spent a lot of time figuring out. So whoever designed this piece of type has carefully considered the proportions of the letter forms, you know? So this typeface, I have never checked this before, but I could almost certainly guarantee that the crossbar would be thinner than the downstroke, because that's the way type designers design typefaces, because we tend to see horizontal shapes as being fatter than vertical shapes. So to compensate for that, the type designers very carefully design the letter form to give the impression that they visually are the same. If you squash the piece of type by doing that, which now you can see in here, this is set to 50.666% on the horizontal scale. We lose that sense of proportion. Now this vertical structure feels too weak to support the top. So you can do it because, like anything, you can break the rules. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but generally speaking, in the typographic community, that's seen as being a definite no-no. And if you're putting together a portfolio and you're applying for design jobs at design studios or advertising agencies, places where people will understand about design, when you start squashing type, unless you're doing it in such a way which is really relevant to the situation, then it's kind of a red flag for them that you're not really fully trained. So try not to squash type either vertically or horizontally unless there is good reason to do it. So sometimes you might do it for the purpose of making typography which feels like it's broken and fragmented and deconstructed and so on, and it's part of the design style. But don't just do it because you need to, you know, make a little bit more space on the page. You can use a more condensed typeface or a more extended typeface in that case, or change the size of the type or some other approach. Underneath that, we had the baseline shift that we looked at. I think I'd done it in the context of a map, but it basically brings the piece of type away from the baseline. Or you can either go up or down. So let's say in this, for instance, I wanted to let the letter P to go up a little bit. I could do that. Or I could have it come down by doing that. So again, it's not something you're going to use very often probably, but it's there as an option.
Professor, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Regarding the typefaces, I noticed that different font families, they have like regular, bold, extended, condensed. Is that referring to the weight, the font weight?
Yeah, it's referring to the font weight. And oftentimes when you're working typographically, it's a good question actually, Chris, because it brings up a point. This isn't quite what you're asking, but it reminds me to talk about another point. So when you're choosing fonts, like when you're choosing fonts for this poster, for instance, like I'm using this font right now called Fat Frank Heavy, which is a font which I think actually I got from you, Chris, because you were using it on your poster.
Yes.
But this font only has one version of that font. It doesn't have like a light version. It doesn't have an italic version. And so if you're trying to use other fonts which are relative to it, you can't really do that. You'd have to choose a different font. So font families can be really useful because you can have fonts which automatically are designed to go together at different weights. As a way to distinguish different aspects of the design or different, you know, create hierarchy and so on, to distinguish different chunks of information. Okay, so I think I've covered everything I want to do in the character panel for right now. What I'd like to talk about is I had done some design in the last week's class where we had designed type using a grid, right?
Yes.
So if I go to Preferences, Guides, and Grid, by default, this grid has 8 subdivisions. So you can make the grid however you want. By default, it's 1-inch squares with 8 subdivisions. So you notice that I just changed mine from 32. When we did this demonstration before, I changed it to 32 after a while so that we could do more fine detail like serifs on the letter forms. But if you remember, we'd begun by creating a font based on the style called de Stijl. De Stijl is actually literally means the style, and it's a Dutch movement at the beginning of the 20th century. So in the early part of the 20th century, and it's based to a large extent on this idea of reducing everything down to very basic rectangular forms. Everything is sort of vertical and horizontal. They do use diagonals a little bit, but for the most part, in the de Stijl style, everything is rectangular. So there's a font actually that was designed by Dozenberg, who's the guy that really started de Stijl, called An Alphabet, which is like this. It's all made out of rectangles. So I do this as a demonstration because it's an easy way for you to start. You know, you can start with just having these basic shapes, but you can always refine them afterwards. So for the letter B, for instance, if I duplicate the A, and then a lot of this is going to involve using Pathfinder. If you want to, you can make an entire alphabet, A through Z, plus the numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you can do that as an extra credit assignment if you want to. So now I'm going to outline mode so I can select these points easily. If I was trying to do it in preview mode, I'd end up moving the shape if I tried to drag over them. But I can just drag over them when I'm in outline mode, and then I can just nudge this up. Because I have snap to grid on right here, when I nudge it, it nudges up within the grid. So if you look at it in preview mode, I'm still snapped into the grid. If I move this one across to here, also it snaps to the grid. And then I can draw a rectangle over this side, select over this shape, and then do minus front. So by just nudging that in a little bit, it looks more like a B than a number 8. And then if I duplicate that, we then end up with something that we can use for the C shape. So for the C, I'm just going to take out this middle section right here. I'll change the color of this so you can see it. So I'm basically leaving 2 squares here and 2 squares here and taking everything out in the middle, minus front. And then with the direct selection tool, I can select these points and nudge it over one. And then I've got my C. So when we were doing this, I was talking about the fact that you could then take this and you could make different versions of it. So you could make another version where you have a rounded version, for instance. So if you select with the direct selection tool, you could go in and round all the sides off. Or maybe you just want to round off some of them. So maybe like all the ones on the bottom. Maybe I just select these and round them off. But you can make a different font this way. Maybe these corners I round off and so on. And don't forget, if you want these corners to be a specific amount, you can double click on the number and then you can specify a numerical value in there. We could also adjust them by creating thicks and thins within it. So for instance, if I was to take the original one and duplicate it again, I could use the direct selection tool, drag up through here and nudge it one way. I can select this bar with the direct selection tool and nudge it up. So that way, if I go into outline mode now, actually this one, I would do the top bar would go up, the center bar would go up, and then this bottom one would go down. This one, it will be the top and the bottom. So these are not random. Like where I'm putting the thicks and thins is based off of typography. So if you look at serif fonts, the position of the thicks and thins is always consistent because it's based off of the way that you hold a pen when you're doing calligraphy. If you want to add smaller detail, like I'd mentioned earlier, if you go to guides and grid and you change this subdivisions to say 32, we can then do much more detailed elements into it. So for instance, I could draw a serif that looks something like this. Of course, if the grid was larger, you'd have to make larger serifs. I couldn't make a serif that's that small. And it might be that I need to do 64, you know, to make it even finer, but we'll leave it like that for now. I'll rotate this one, or reflect it, I should say, and then drag this one into position. And then once you've got those serifs, you can always use them again by duplicating them. And you could duplicate a copy of them horizontally and nudge that out of the way. Then you can kind of use them like Lego. So anytime you want a serif, then you can just bang one into place and they snap into position because we've got snap to grid, so it's easy to position it. Take this one and put it here and so on. And then once you're happy with them, you can select the whole thing, Pathfinder Unite, and then that becomes one shape. So that's designing fonts using a grid structure. There is a lot more to designing fonts that I'm going into, but it's enough for you to get started if you're interested in it. There is also a software which you can get, which is a plugin for Illustrator, which I'm going to try and install and do a demonstration of at some point. It's called Font Self, and it allows you to create your font in Illustrator and then drag that into a panel in Illustrator, which will then convert it into a font that you could type with. Okay, I'm going to take the grid off now and take off snap to grid. Another way of designing typefaces that came about in the 1990s is hybrid fonts. A hybrid font is a combination of serif and sans serif usually, although not necessarily, but generally it's taking fonts and combining them together. So let's say I take a letter A that says serif font. So this one's Garamond, and then I duplicate that one by dragging it and holding Option. And I'm going to change the font for this one to Gil Sans Light. So now we have these two A's. Notice that one A is bigger than the other one, even though that in terms of the point size, they're the same. So this is 159.64, whatever. Let's make it 160 to make it a round number. And this one is the same. So 160. But you can see that the Gil Sans is a higher position than the Garamond. This is an old style font. They tend to have a low X height. But we measure type from the top of the ascender to the bottom of the descender. So depending on where your X height is relative to that, it might look small or it might look big. So certain fonts are designed specifically to look big on the page, like Helvetica and Times New Roman. The purpose of those designs was to make them look large on the page so you can see them easily. Okay, so I'm going to take these fonts apart by doing Create Outlines. Before I do that, I'm going to make the Gil Sans font the same size visually here. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to scale it down a little bit. And then type Create Outlines is Shift-Command-O or Shift-Control-O if you're working on a PC. And all I'm going to do is take off part of this by using the knife tool. I'm going to cut through the front of this and cut through the front of this one. I need to have this selected to cut through it. And then I'm going to take this off here and add it to this one. So I'm going to put this right at the very top. They don't connect perfectly, you know, like the curves are a little different and stuff. So then you have a decision to make, which is a design decision, is do you want to keep that broken feel or do you want it to be smoothed out? So hybrid fonts come in sort of two forms in that respect. Sometimes they purposefully make it obvious that it's a hybrid font and you can see the sort of collage nature of the typeface. Other times it'll be discrete and hidden. So if I make a copy of this, copy paste in front. So Command C is to copy, Command F is to paste in front. So I have another copy of this sitting on top of that one now. And then if I do Command 5, remember Command 5 is View, Guides, Make Guides. Now I've done that, I can delete points and rearrange points, but I still have references to where the shape was previously. So here, for instance, I want to readjust this so it has more of a curve at the top. So I'm going to pull this out. And then I'm going to also readjust this side a little bit so it matches back up closer to what it was previously. this part in here as well, I'm going to delete this anchor point, but then drag this handle up so that it matches that guide that I have from previously. Actually, it doesn't match it, but it's in relationship to it. So now I have a smoothed out version of that font. So that's the idea of hybrid fonts, is that you're making a font by taking fonts which already exist and then changing them by slicing them together and putting them, combining them together to make a new font. Another way to create a font from an existing font would be to modify it in some way. So for instance, there was a series of fonts that were designed in the 90s called Blur. These fonts right here. So the way that these fonts are created, they were designed by Neville Brody, who's a famous British graphic designer who designed Face magazine. He also designed a magazine which was called Phew, which is all about typography. And this is one of his early fonts. So basically what he was doing was taking a font that already existed, blurring it in Photoshop, and then sharpening it up using a program called Streamline. Streamline has actually been incorporated into Illustrator, and it's now called Image Trace, or Live Trace, actually, sorry. So if I take a piece of type, like I'll take this one, and then let me change this font to make it a little bit bolder. So I'll take a regular version. If I then go to Object and I rasterize it, so this changes it now into a bitmap image, right? Converts it from a vector into a bitmap. I also want to have a bit of space around the outside of it so that when I blur it, there's somewhere for the blur to go. So now this is an image. If I zoom in close on it, you'll start to see pixels. Now what I can do is I can go to effects, and using these Photoshop effects, I can do a Gaussian blur on it. When I blur the type, it's rounding off the corners. Depending on how much you blur it, it'll round them off more. Then if I go up to Image Trace and I choose Silhouettes, we then have a vector version of it again. You can see in this case, it's kind of filling in a lot of the space, but if I go to Image Trace and I readjust the threshold, I can adjust how much black is being used. And you can get these really beautiful elements where things start to kind of break apart a little bit. It's almost like you're looking at something that has sun shining from it, and then expand that. So now it's a vector again. So there's lots of ways of working with type. It's a very interesting creative medium, I think, that is really worth exploring. If you're interested in design in general, graphic design in particular, or things like motion graphics, or if you're interested in UX design, web design, understanding fonts and typography is really an essential part of being able to work effectively as a designer. Okay. You're all still with me, right? I haven't cut out?
No.
I'm all paranoid now. I keep thinking I'm going to be lecturing for an hour and then I'll come back and you've gone. All right, let's see. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about styles, and then I'm going to go over choosing fonts, and then we're going to take a look at hierarchy. So we'll start with the styles first of all. So styles is is something which is available in Illustrator, although it's actually more effective in InDesign. So I actually don't use styles very often in Illustrator, but I wanted to show them to you because first of all, they work in pretty much the same way in InDesign. So if you know them here, you'll know them in InDesign as well. But also there are occasions where they can be very useful inside of Illustrator. If you're a web designer, or if you've done web design classes, you'll have an understanding of what CSS is, right? So CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, is a way for you to save formatting that you can then apply to HTML. So this is not exactly the same thing, but it's very, very similar. When you're working in Illustrator or in InDesign, you can create what are called character styles and paragraph styles. So in Illustrator, the way that you would see this is if you go under type, and then you go down to paragraph styles, and you'll notice that these two panels are nested together. So I've got character styles and paragraph styles. In InDesign, you also have things like object styles, table styles, and cell styles. We don't have all of that in Illustrator, but we do have the paragraph styles, and we have character styles. So the difference between these is that a paragraph style will always apply to an entire paragraph. Let me set this type to something more like body copy. So we'll set this to 12 point. And then I'm going to right click on here and choose fill with placeholder text. And then let's also adjust our tracking so that it's, oh, sorry, the leading, so that it's set to auto. So now we have a bit of type that we can work with. I think I'm going to add a little bit more type in here. So I'll copy this and then just paste it down here. If I go to type, show hidden characters, you can see that there's this little blue symbol of a backwards P. This represents the paragraph symbol or a return. It means that there's a return that takes place here. So this is a paragraph right here, but a paragraph could actually be just one word. So this is now a paragraph because we have a return before it and we have a return after it. So if I select that piece of type and I create a paragraph style, and I call this one subhead, or I might call it heading, or I might call it caption or whatever. In this case, I'm going to call it subhead. And then if I double click on that paragraph style, I can change settings for it. So for instance, I'm going to change this to bold. I'm also going to change the size to 18 point. I'm also going to change the tracking to -25. And then let's also change the color to red. Okay, so we've got settings now for this paragraph style. If I was to go to this area and just put my cursor inside it and click subhead, it's now applied to all of that. So, but I only want it to apply to a little bit of it. So I'm going to hit return here and we'll apply it to this one. I'll go down a little bit further and we'll apply it to another one. So the idea of these styles is that you can save all that formatting. So anytime you want to use it, you can simply select the piece of type and apply it. You don't have to go in there and make all of the changes individually. It's already sort of stored and you can go back and do it. So the paragraph style, if you double click on it, not only can I change the basic character formats, but I can also do things like indents and spacing. I can do tabs. I can set the alignment of the type to left or centered and so on. That's the difference between that and a character style. A character style, if I make a character style, can really only format the character, like the size of the type, stuff like that. But the advantage of a character style is I can apply it within a piece of text. So for instance, I could apply it to just this piece of text right here. If I create a character style, and I'm going to call this one emphasis. But again, it could be, you can name it whatever you want. So this time I'm going to make this one italic. I'll also make the color change. Let's make this one blue. So now anytime I want to change that, I can go in here and select a piece of word or a piece of type. Click on emphasis, and then it'll apply it. So the first thing is that it speeds up the process of applying the styles to different pieces of text throughout a book. But also, if I wanted to change it later on, like let's say later on I'd shown it to a client and they said, yeah, we don't like the red type on the subheads. You can double click on the subhead then, go into character color, and you could change the color of that then to a different color. And it will change to anywhere where you've used that style setting. So the reason that this is more useful in InDesign is that InDesign is generally used for creating multi-page documents like books, brochures, catalogs, that type of thing. And so in those situations where you've got multiple pages, like I have a book right now that I'm working on, which is 450 pages. And throughout that book, within the styles, you might have, for instance, I might have something like 1,000 some odd captions. So if those are not done as styles, if I wanted to change the look of those captions later on, I'd have to literally go in and select each one of those 1,000 captions and then change the formatting for it. Whereas if I have it set up as a style, that I can change the style in the paragraph style or the character style, whichever one it was set up as, and then it will automatically change throughout the entire book. So in Illustrator, you very rarely have that level of, you know, that amount of stuff which needs to be changed. It's usually you're working with relatively smaller amounts of text because you're usually working on things which are single page or maybe like a flyer or a folder or something like that. But it could still be useful. And if you understand this idea here, it'll translate when you start using InDesign, if you haven't used InDesign already. Okay, so that's styles. Paragraph styles and character styles. Does anybody have questions about that before I move on? Okay. Let's talk about choosing type. Some of this is relatively new. So if you've used Illustrator for a while, you may have noticed some changes, but you may not have really explored it. So if, for instance, I go into this font right here and click on the arrow on the side of where the font is, we get this list of fonts that you can choose from, right? But also you'll notice underneath here, there's a thing that says filters. So if you click on that, there's a little arrow here. You get this flyout menu where you can choose to limit what you're looking for. So let's say I only wanted to look for Gothic fonts. I can see that I only have one Gothic font available to look for. But I could also go to find more. And then what it's doing is it's searching all of the Adobe fonts. And then it's finding any Adobe fonts which are black letter typefaces. And if I wanted to use a different one, so let's say I wanted to load, let's see. Let's say I wanted to load this one right here. Pragmata Pro Fraktur. So on this one, it says, if I put my cursor over this cloud icon right here, it says activate. So if I click on that, it says activate these fonts. There are 2 of them. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. So there's 2 versions of that particular font. And then if I want to use that, I then have that available in Illustrator. So you can either filter fonts just for the fonts that you're looking for, that you already have loaded, or you could also filter them whilst you're trying to find additional fonts to activate. And just to clarify, this activating process is a relatively new thing. In fonts, you used to have to load fonts. So you would download a font from a website, and it was a file that lived on your hard drive that you would double click on and install in a program called Font Book on a Mac. And you can still do that if you want to. So you could go to a website like DaFont, for instance, and you could download a free font, or you could go to a font website like typography.com, which is the home of Hoffler, the type designer, and you could buy a font from him and download it, and then you could install it that way. But Adobe have incorporated within the Creative Cloud, you have access to their entire font library now. And Adobe are probably the biggest font foundry in the world. They own more fonts than any other company probably. So you have access to thousands of fonts by going to find fonts here and then looking for the font that you want. And these filters make it easier for you to find stuff. So you can go, I only want to look at sans serif typefaces. But also, not only that, you can go, so from that classification, you can go down to properties and you go, okay, I want sans serif, but I also want them to be condensed. I also want them to be bold. So now you've only got bold, condensed faces that you're looking at. All right. So that's finding fonts.
I just have a question.
Sure.
So now if we see that, let's say in design and Photoshop, if we download that typeface, would it also be available for all the other softwares?
Yeah, so the fonts are, then the font is available. Well, actually, so it depends how you do it. If you're activating the font, yeah, it becomes activated in your Creative Cloud. So it would be available with all your like Photoshop, Illustrator, and so on. If you're doing it where you double click to install the font, it's actually activated on your system. So any computer, any software that you are using, doesn't matter whether it's the Adobe Creative Cloud or Microsoft Word or whatever, all of those software would then have access to that font. Okay. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I don't remember, to be honest with you, whether I mentioned this in the last class. I probably mentioned it, but I don't think I went into a lot of detail about it. But what I would like to talk about is hierarchy. So as a designer, you oftentimes receive text that looks kind of like this. It's just a bunch of text. There's no hierarchy in it at all. A hierarchy means the order of importance, right? Which things are most important? And in typography, this is one of the fundamental things that you need to sort of recognize in the process of doing typography, is that as part of your job as a designer, you're deciding what's the most important thing, what's the next most important thing, and so on. So you're creating a hierarchy within the design so that the viewer knows where to go first, where to go next, and so on. It gives them a route through the design. So on this one, for instance, I've done two examples here which create a different set of hierarchy. I've basically switched the hierarchy. So here I've got the word hierarchy as the important element. It's the same information on all three of these pages. On this one, there's no formatting. On this one, I've formatted it so that the word hierarchy is the most important thing. So this is the thing that draws us in. On this one, I've made the hierarchy lecture for MM340 hierarchy. Now lecture for MM340 is the most important thing. So this is one of the things that when you're doing the poster design, I want you to think about. So you may only have, sort of one bit of information where it says vote. But if you have additional bits of information, because I didn't specify this on this project, but if you had additional bits of information like the date, or there's like a subtitle, or there's some additional information on where to get voting information from, or maybe you've added some statistics which support the idea overall. Those secondary bits of information would need to be clearly defined as separate. So the way that we can create hierarchy, the way that you make something feel like it's more important, you can do that in a variety of different ways. If you simply separate something, it becomes more important. So on something like this, for instance, if you were doing a piece of design where you weren't allowed to do any kind of formatting, you couldn't have anything bigger or smaller or anything like that. You simply by taking the word hierarchy and putting it by itself would make that feel like it's more important than anything else on the page. Like if I did that, this then becomes the important element. It's also important because it's first. So we tend to read from, well, we do read from top to bottom. So we're going to most likely go here first. Because this is small though, there is a tendency for us to miss it. So we might just start here. So this is why it might also be useful to reinforce the hierarchy, to make this element bigger or bolder or both. So by enlarging it, we create a sense of hierarchy. If this bit was offset from this one, it also distinguishes it, separates it. If it was a different font altogether, so if this was a serif typeface, let me take my filters off. There's one thing with the filters that you have to remember to do is take them off afterwards. Otherwise you search for fonts and then you can't find them. So this distinguishes it. You can also distinguish it by color. So here I've changed this to bright red. Bright red is the color which draws the eye more than any other. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all bright red. It could be that we just put like a little triangle here. that says start here, everybody. That's pretty straightforward, pretty direct, but you know, it's pretty effective. There's no doubt there which one you need to go to first, which is the most important in the hierarchy. So think about this when you're doing your posters. Think about that idea of hierarchy in design. I'd also want you to talk a little bit about using blocked text. So for instance, if we take the term get out the vote, and I'm going to do this in a blocky sans serif typeface because it'll work better for this demonstration. So let me eyedropper this font. The font that I'm using here, by the way, is Helvetica. Helvetica is an interesting font because, first of all, it's probably one of the most commonly used fonts ever. It's very strongly associated with a movement in design called the Swiss International Style. And it's sometimes referred to as the face without a face. It has very little personality to it. But the advantage of that is that you could kind of put any flavor to it. It's a little bit like tofu. So I actually quite like working with Helvetica oftentimes because you can do things with it by playing around with spacing and weight and stuff like that. So here, for instance, as a way to create hierarchy within this sentence, I could have this be set to light and then the word vote set to bold. So the word vote then becomes a very strong standout kind of message. But if I keep them as a big block like this, for block text, it also tends to work better if it's all uppercase. So if I choose type, change case, I can change the case after I've typed it from upper to lower to title case or sentence case. In this case, I want it to be uppercase. Again, I'd want to go in here and kern the lettering. So particularly with something like this, where you're making a block of text. So the idea of creating a block of text is where everything sort of aligns to itself. So you have one set of text, which is all kind of aligning. So this, to make these two lines of text line up, I could have this one be a little bit smaller. And then I can adjust the spacing here. We could also adjust the spacing between lines of text. But this is sometimes a useful way to get a very strong, powerful message, is by blocking all the text together like that into one big chunk. If you wanted to reinforce it further, another way of setting this out, let's show another example of it. If I take that piece of type again, but this time I'm going to have get out the vote. Now this piece of type here in the middle can be smaller. We want to have the leading closer. And then let's make get just a little bit bigger. So it doesn't always work, but sometimes it's kind of a useful way to kind of make a very strong statement in typography, especially when these kinds of things get very large. They have a real power to them. There's big blocks of text like that. Hand-drawn lettering. And you can find hand-drawn fonts. Hand-drawn fonts are always a little bit weird to me because they're repeating letters, so it doesn't really look like hand-drawn lettering. If you're going to do hand-drawn lettering, I would suggest that you draw something on a piece of paper and then scan it in, and then, or photograph it, This is really more, rather than a demonstration, because I'm not going to go over this in detail right now, but rather than a demonstration, I just wanted to suggest it as an option, because there is a tendency for people to default to just using fonts for creating letter forms. But there was a student yesterday that had shown me a sketch in one of the crits that I was doing for another class. And he had done some lettering that was just hand-drawn lettering for his sketch that he was then going to replace with a font. But actually the hand-drawn lettering itself was really nice. It had a really kind of like human feel to it. So even something like this, it doesn't necessarily, the hand-drawn lettering doesn't necessarily have to be something which is very, very refined. It could be something quite casual. And the way that you write something, just in the same way as choosing a font, the way that you write something says something about the meaning. So it maybe makes it seem friendly, or it makes it feel like there's a kind of agitation going on, or it makes it feel like there is a sense of tradition. You can express things just by the way that you draw something. So it's kind of like the way that you say something, right? There's certain words that you say, but depending on how you say them, you can get a very different kind of impression created. So for instance, if you're in a relationship with somebody and somebody says to you, "Oh, you did a great job there," with that expression, it's kind of like being sarcastic. But if you said, "Oh, you did a great job there, well done," the tone of your voice makes a huge amount of difference. That's not a great example that I showed you, but I think you understand what I mean. The way that you say it in verbal terms is kind of what typography is about. And it can express as much, or maybe as much, it can certainly influence the way that we understand what's actually being said in the words. It can reinforce it, or it can detract from it. The other thing I wanted to talk about, because remember on this project, you're going to do one version, which is going to end up on a t-shirt, and you need to create that t-shirt design as 3 spot colors. So in Illustrator, if I go to the swatches panel, all of the colors that are in here, or I should say, none of the colors that are in here are spot colors. And I know that just by looking at it. If there was a spot color in here, I could tell because in the corner of one of these swatches, there would be a little white triangle with a dot inside of it. If I go down to here and click on libraries, I can choose color books. And one of the color books I could choose would be Pantone solid coated. This is probably the most commonly used color matching systems. These are all color matching systems. Pantone is the most common one, and there are different forms like CMYK coated, metallic coated, and so on. But if I choose this solid coated one, I then have a bunch of spot colors to choose from. And I could type in a number. So for instance, if I wanted 186, I could type in 186, and there's the red color that I want to use for 186. And now it's loaded in my swatches. So this is one way to get a spot color. And this is probably the most common way that you would choose spot colors, is to use the Pantone system. Spot colors are, however, used for other things other than printing. So they're used for things like dyes, perforations, things which are considered additions to the printing process. So additions to the printing process include dyes, perforations, embossings, debossings. And embossing is where something is pushed out of a piece of paper. So if you feel it, it has like a, you might have a logo, for instance, embossed on a business card. It might also be printed, but it might have an embossing so it stands out, so you can actually feel it with your fingers. A die line would be used to cut out unusual shapes. So for instance, if a book cover has a hole in it so you can see the hardcover underneath, that would be a die cut. Package designs, which are like an unusual shape, they're not a rectangle, those would need to have a die created for it. And so those would also want to be a spot color, so it could separate from CMYK. But for the t-shirt, you need to define 3 spot colors. So one way to do that, probably the best way, is to choose from these Pantone colors. if you were choosing these Pantone colors, ideally you would have a set of Pantone books. So Pantone books look like this. So the basic set of CMYK books is $169. You can get like a complete set, which is about $700, I think, which has all the other books. But the one that you would probably use the most would be the spot coated. And this would be useful, particularly if you're doing print graphics. If you're doing stuff which is going to be on the web, then this Pantone system isn't particularly useful for you. Although you may get work from other designers if you're working professionally where stuff is using Pantone, and you still might need to have the books available to you. But for professional designers, you should have a set of Pantone books to use. Another way you can make a spot color, though, is if I click here, and right now it's already spot color, but if I was to just choose a color, say I choose this color, and I create a new swatch, you can see that by default, it's process color. The reason that by default it was a spot color before is because I had just had that spot color that we picked, the 186 chosen, but now it's coming up as a process color. I can change it to spot right here though, rather than process. This model underneath, so a spot color isn't CMYK, but you can model the color using CMYK. But you could also model it using HSB or RGB or some other color, okay? So maybe this spot color, for instance, is going to be used to create a varnish. So for instance, let's say I wanted this piece of hierarchy on a book cover to be shiny, but I wanted everything else to be flat. I can make a copy of that piece of type, paste it in front, so there's one sitting on top of the other, and change this one so that it's set to varnish. And then in the attributes panel, I would set that to overprint fill. So the reason for doing that is that by default, anything that's printing is knocking out what's underneath it. So that red would disappear when it outputs. But if I have it like this, where it's set to overprint, that varnish, which won't actually be purple, it will be clear, will print over the top of that red. So you'll have the red printed, and then you'll have a shiny clear coat printed wherever this purple is. Does that make sense to everybody? Let me get out of sharing for a second. So does that make sense to you, how that works with the attributes? I realize that that gets a little bit technical. And you may very rarely have to do that kind of work. You may never actually. If you're in web design or you're going into video stuff, you would never. This is really specifically for print graphics. But if you're doing print graphics, it's a good idea to understand how things knock out or overprint and stuff like that. It used to be that you would have to have much greater understanding of this because we used to have to do what's called trapping. But these days, most of the time when you output stuff professionally to a print shop, they use a software which automatically traps your Illustrator files. So before we used to have to do things where we would put like a stroke around the outside of an object and then set the stroke to overprint so that if it misprinted slightly, there was a slight overlap of the colors so that there wouldn't be a white gap created.
The screen is not shared, John.
Right now I stopped sharing because I wasn't sure if everybody was here and I was just talking, but I'm going to share my screen again right now.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you talk about spot color, we use Pantone colors. Is that 3 different Pantones? Or can it be one color Pantone with different shades?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So for the requirements for the project, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so it should be 3 separate spot colors. Now, if you wanted to, you could do it with 1 or 2 colors. Actually, I didn't really specify that but your design might be a more limited color panel. And like maybe you're using red, white, and blue. Well, white isn't a color if you're printing it onto a white T-shirt. So you might just use 2 colors in that design, but they should be spot colors. So one color could be like Pantone 186, for instance, and another one might be Pantone 256. So you've got a blue and a red, right? But you can't use more than 3 colors, okay? So you can use 2 colors. You could use 1 color if you wanted to, but you can't use more than 3 colors, and they have to be spot colors, not CMYK. Okay. All right. So the next part of the demonstrations are going to be stuff that we haven't looked at before. All right, let me just show you this one real quickly. So I had worked with Chris the other day one-on-one a little bit, and Chris had done this, which I like the idea of this one, where he'd taken the V and extended it to make it into a check mark. I think he was using this font even. And then this is an illustration that he had done as a sketch, which I liked. And he had this thing that says, "Your vote shall set you free." So don't steal his sentence, because that's a good sentence. But the idea was, so I was just sort of showing him how you could maybe illustrate it in such a way that it's simple. And we talked about this guy called Sol Bass. You may have come across Sol Bass. He's a very well-known American designer from the mid-20th century, most famous for doing kind of movie posters. So if you look at his work, it's very powerful and strong because of its simplicity. Like you look at this film poster, Anatomy of a Murder. I like also the fact that here's a good example of hand-drawn lettering. He's not using a font for this. He's just drawing the letters into the negative space, right? Or the letters become the negative space, actually. They're sort of bleeding into the space around the figure from the figure itself. So a lot of his illustration style is like that, very simple and choppy, almost like you're cutting out bits of paper. So this style lends itself to Illustrator greatly, because Illustrator is very much like that. If you use the pen tool, you just click, click, click. You don't have to click and drag. You can create these squared off kind of like, almost like you cut it out with scissors kind of illustrations, which are simple and direct and can be very powerful way of representing your idea. So I just thought I'd leave this because I'd done this after I'd spoken to Chris a little bit. I didn't show Chris this final version, but I did this to show you guys how you could like take what you've got and sort of refine it a little bit. Okay. Here's another example of that idea of stacked type, where the type is made to fit within this structure, all capital letters, very close leading, close tracking. You get this chunk of type that you can use to put across a powerful message, particularly for things like posters. Oh, at the top here, actually, one of the things I talked about with Chris is that maybe he could also use hand-drawn letterings, kind of like Sol Bass had done on that poster. So I'm not saying that he should do, but this is an option which you oftentimes don't think about. You know, you can always use letters that you're drawing yourself. You don't have to use a font. Okay, moving on to the new stuff. So I have 2 animation demonstrations I want to do for you. One of them is using a blend in Illustrator. So I didn't quite finish this illustration. You can see I was starting to draw some shapes over the top of here that I was going to use for wheat, but I've got enough here to give you an idea. So I'm going to do select, same, fill color, because actually I wanted these to be on multiply. And then with that still selected, I could add a few more. So the way that I'm creating this illustration is basically by just cutting shapes and using the pen tool. It's very basic. There's nothing complicated about it. You do want to have a little bit of an understanding of the way that light works and perspective works helps. But really all I'm doing is I need something for this animation as a background. So I've drawn this landscape. And then I've also got on a separate layer a vehicle that I can drive across the screen. So in retrospect, it would have been better, I think, for the idea that I've ended up kind of squashing into this illustration if I'd done an aeroplane maybe, but I could change that for the next version. Remember that when you're working on your posters, you should be doing versions of them. If you're just doing one version and settling on that, you've probably not done enough work. So do one version, duplicate it, and then make some changes and improve it, or do a different idea. When you present the final version for critique, you might have several that you want to show, and then we can talk about which one works better. So I won't finish that, but you get the idea. I'm just drawing out a illustration. I will make a video which demonstrates this in more detail, but I didn't think it was necessary during the lab portion of the class because it takes a while just to build the illustration. Same with the car, but I'm basically making everything out of basic shapes rectangles, combining them like we did in the symbols project. So I'm using Pathfinder to combine two rectangles over the top of each other. So this starts, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but it started with just a rectangle and another rectangle, and then I unite them either by using the shape builder tool and dragging through them, or by using the Pathfinder panel and then uniting them. And then you can use the direct selection tool to move anchor points around. You can also nudge them with the arrows, of course, and refine the shape of that car so it looks a little bit more like a car. I could also use the anchor point tool to add some curves, like on the top of the roof, underneath the car maybe, just very slightly on the ends of the car perhaps. And then I could also select certain anchor points, like maybe the top ones, for instance, and round off the corners with those rounding corner widgets so that we've got a more rounded shape altogether. I'm not doing the ones on the inside here because I want that to stay as a sharp edge. So I didn't select all of them to do it. But the ones at the bottom I could do as well. And then maybe I want to select through all of these bottom points and nudge it up a little bit so it's a little bit less narrow, less tall. So something like that. And then the windows I'm drawing over the top as just a shape with the pen tool, but you could start with a rectangle. You know, you could drag out a black rectangle like this. And then if we select both of those, use shape builder, option click to get rid of that part of it. And then I can nudge it back a little bit. So we have the down bar on the front where the windscreen is. And then maybe I want to add a little bit of an angle here. Let's get rid of the stroke on the outside. And then I can put a bar through here that's red. That'll indicate where the window is. Maybe I want to round this off. So you get the idea. It's the same kind of processes that we've been using in some of the other projects to build this out. You know, with the wheel, I had drawn this shape and then rotated it, kind of like the flower we did right at the beginning of the semester. So if you just draw one shape for this wheel, and then I choose the rotate tool, and I option click in the center of the wheel, set it, this time I'm going to set it to 60 degrees, hit copy, and then do Command D, Command D, Command D to go all the way around. The wheel itself starts off with a circle, and then I'm double clicking on the scale tool to scale it to make a smaller one, and then make a lighter version of it. And then I've also put a stroke around the outside of it. And then there's another smaller version inside of that. So it's just a accumulation of objects, right, that build up that complexity. It's actually nothing complicated there at all. It's all very simple. And then the other wheel is a duplicate of it, right? I've also added this flag at the back that says vote. And then all of this has to be grouped together. So now if I select this, you can see that this is all one group. Even the shadow, which is underneath it, which is a slightly darker version of the road color, that's part of that group, because I want the shadow to animate along with the car, right? All right, so once I've got that done, let me drag this out a little bit further, it's not quite on the end. The idea of this assignment is to use the blend tool as a way to animate an object across the screen. So we've got this object, or this group of objects. They have to be grouped, that's very important. Otherwise, each of the objects will blend separately, and we need them to blend as a group. I'm going to make a duplicate of this on the other side of the screen where the car has gone all the way across. And then I'm going to choose the blend tool. On the blend tool, I'm going to click on the car on this side, and then click on the car on this side. And then we'll have a blend that goes across. If I double click on the blend tool, I have this specified as specified steps at 36 steps. Now this is only set up this way because I had done this previously before we started the class. By default, it would be smooth color. And then you can see there's just enough cars to fill the space in between. But if I set it to specified steps, I can specify how many steps based on the frames per second. So we have to do a little bit of math, I'm sorry. I apologize, but we're gonna have to do this. It's simple math though, so don't worry. All we got to figure out is if I'm exporting this at 12 frames per second, which is what I'm going to do. 12 frames per second, by the way, is about the minimum you can do. If you do 24 frames per second, that's a standard animation frame rate. So I'm just basically cutting that in half because it will make a smaller file size. But I could do 24 frames per second. It would make it smoother. Okay, so if I'm doing 12 frames per second and I want it to last for 3 seconds, all I have to do is times the 12 by 3. Well, that's how I ended up with 36. So we've got 36 steps. So those steps within your blend, when you export it, get converted into frames. So I'm going to first of all save this file. And then once I've saved the file, I'm going to go to File, Export, and Export As. When you export from Illustrator, you can export in a variety of different formats: PNG, BMP or bitmap, CSS, AutoCAD, and so on. One of the options is Flash SWF. I should point out that Flash is a deprecated format, meaning that it really isn't very much use these days. So I'm giving you this demonstration to show you how you can export stuff from Illustrator as an animation. I'll go into next week's class and we'll talk about how we can make it into a video by using a very simple part of using Animate, just to kind of export the project out better. But for right now, we're just going to do it this way so we can see what we've got. So I'm going to choose Flash SWF and then hit Export and hit Replace. When I do that, I get to this dialog box, and at the top we have these 2 tabs. By default, you'll probably be in Basic to begin with, and where it says Export As will most likely say AI file to SWF file. That will be the default position. So if you've never been to this dialog box before, it's almost certainly that's set to that. But what we're looking for is AI layers to SWF frames. So that may be a little bit confusing because we actually only have 2 layers. We have 1 layer for the car and 1 layer for the background. So we've only really got 2 frames according to that. But what's happening is that there is an option in the advanced settings where we can choose the blend. And basically what it's doing is as it's exporting it, it's using that blend or the sections within the blend and converting them into layers, which then get converted into frames. At least conceptually, that's the way you can think of it. But actually, they're just converting into frames. So then I want to have clip to artboard size checked because we've got artwork like the car on the beginning and the car at the end is outside of the artboard, right? I don't want to see that. So I have clip to artboard size on. Under the advanced settings, I'm going to leave everything basically the same here. Now, yours won't have all of these settings on, but I want to have looping on, so I've checked that. I want to have animate blends on, so this is where the magic happens for this particular demo because we're using a blend. So obviously very important to check animate blends. And we want in sequence, not in build. It will by default choose in sequence, by the way. So in sequence means it plays 1 frame, that frame disappears, and then a new frame shows up. And then that disappears and a new frame shows up. Whereas in build, what it would do is it would show 1 frame, that one would stay in place, and then another one would show up. And then that one would stay in place as well, and another one would show up. So if you're trying to make something grow, like a plant, in build would work. Or if you want to make something build, like a building, you might use in build. But for what we're doing here, we're moving something, not growing something. So it's in sequence. And then underneath that, it says layer order, leave that on bottom up. And then underneath that, it says export static layers. I want to have that checked because my background is going to stay the same the entire time. That's not 1 frame which flashes and then disappears. That one stays throughout the whole animation. It's only the car which is going to move because it has a blend on it. So let's go ahead and press OK. And then this is the file that I've just produced. So it's this one here, which is called animation.swf. If I double click to open it, it's opening in this weird program for some reason. I've forgotten about that. Let me force quit that. Shouldn't be opening in there. It should be opening in FlashKit. So, sorry, in Flash Player. So let me right click on it and choose Open With and make sure I'm choosing Flash Player. There we go. So you can see that mine didn't work. So there's something that's not working on here. Let's have a look why it was. Let's try exporting it again. So I've got my 2 separate layers, got the car on 1 layer, the background on another layer. So that's one important thing we have to have. We've got the blend set up, but let's make sure the blend is correct. It looks like my car over here is on the other side. It's kind of hard to tell always with these things, but if I do Command Y, I can see it now. So the cars are in the right place. That's all right. Let's go to File, Export again, Export As. So that it's less confusing, I'm just going to do it onto my desktop this time. That way I can distinguish it from other ones, and hit Export. And then let's look at the basic settings again. AI layers to SWF frames is what we want, so that's good. Clip artboard to artboard size, that's good. We've got animate blends on in sequence, export static layer, background layer. Okay, so everything seems to be right. Let's try it one more time. I'll go to the desktop and then find that animation file. And again, I have to right click on it and then choose Flash Player. Okay, now we've got it. I don't know why it didn't work the first time. I didn't change any settings, but now it's working. It should actually be closed up to that point. That's where the animation should come. So this is set up at 1080 by 1080 by the Instagram, like the Instagram ad. So this is not a very good ad, but I just wanted to demonstrate the idea of using a blend to do an animation. Maybe it could go a little bit slower as the car go across. So all I'd have to do to change that is to change the number of steps. If I made it 48 steps instead of 36 steps, it would then take 4 seconds to get across the screen. And obviously you could keep increasing it and slowing the car down by increasing the number of steps in between. So that's the first demonstration. Another way that you can animate in Illustrator or from Illustrator is to use a frame by frame process. So for this, I'm using a very basic setup. I have on the first layer, I've got a blob that I've drawn. There's also a background color in here that I've added. So I've drawn a rectangle that covers the entire area and filled that with color. This background image, by the way, could be a photographic image. It could be a very complicated illustration. But this part of it is going to stay the same the whole time. So this is kind of like the background that I did in the last animation, in that it stays static. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it on the same layer as the illustration, but I'm going to lock it. And then what I would do is duplicate it. And because this one's locked, I can't accidentally change the blue at all, but I can change this one. Now to see what I'm doing, it would be helpful if on this layer, I select the layer and lower the opacity. So I've set it down to 50%, which you can't see any difference because the same thing is underneath it. But if I modify this, like if I move it over here, you can see that there's transparency now. And then if I use the pencil tool, I could modify this shape to make it slightly different. The principle of animation is incredibly simple. Basically what you have is a collection of drawings which are all slightly different from each other, right? Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that to make good animation. It's like anything. Most things are relatively simple, but to do it well is complicated. It gets more difficult. But the basic idea of animation is very, very simple. All we're doing is we're creating another drawing, which is a little different from the drawing before. So you could either take the drawing like I'm doing here and modifying it, because it's digital, we can modify it more easily. Or you could just redraw it again. So I could take my Wacom tablet and draw out a shape, or my mouse for that matter, draw out a shape over the top of it, which is similar to the one that was there before, but it's a little bit different. So again, the transparency is necessary because we get that kind of onion skin effect where we can see what's happened in previous layers. So I'm going to delete that one because I've already got the layers I need for this animation. Basically what I'm doing is I'm going up on each frame, I'm changing its shape very slightly, right? The next set, starting from here on, are the same ones again, except I've duplicated them. So I actually want these to go the other way around. I select from here to here, and then go to the pull down the side and choose reverse order. Now the animation is going to go to a certain point, and then it's going to come back again. because I've reversed all of those frames, which were duplicates of the first set. So to duplicate the frames in the first place, what I'm doing is, let me make sure I'm on the beginning. Yeah, so if I go from here, let me delete these frames for a second. So I'm referring to them as frames. They're layers right now, but ultimately they will be frames. So each one of these layers will ultimately end up being a frame. So to duplicate the layers, I can select all of them. So I select to the top one, hold Shift, select to the bottom one, then hold Option and drag them up. And you can see that when I get to the top, there's a little plus sign. I now have all of these layers are duplicates of the first set. So if I then select them all again, I can go to the pull down on the side and choose reverse order. So you don't necessarily have to do that. This is just something that you could do within the process. Once you've made a bunch of frames, because animation is time consuming, if you wanted it to reverse itself, you could duplicate the layers and then reverse the order. The process of exporting it is basically the same as the last one, except that we're going to make a couple of changes. So I'm going to choose Flash, frame by frame. Let's do it on the desktop so I see where it's going more easily and get it quicker. And then hit export. So the basic setting is going to change stay the same. AI layers to SWF frames, clip to artboard size, although in this case, there's nothing outside of the artboard, but it doesn't harm to have that on. And then under the advanced setting, I'm going to keep everything except I don't want animate blends because we're not animating a blend here. We're doing frame by frame animation. And then I'm going to take off export static layers. So I don't want one of the layers to stay there all the time because I've incorporated my background into every single layer throughout the document. By the way, I didn't do this, but one tip that I could give you is that on these backgrounds, because it's repeating on every single frame, as a way to save memory, what I could have done is I could have selected that initial background on the first layer and converted it into a symbol. So that way, every time I duplicate it, it's just an instance of that same symbol. And so it'll save memory. Instead of me having hundreds, if I was doing hundreds of frames, hundreds of that blue rectangle, I would only have one, and then instances of it, which don't add to the memory. So we can reduce the file size that way. Okay, so let's see what we've got once we've exported it. So this one is called frame by frame. So let me go down to the frame by frame SWF. Here we go. And again, I don't want to open it in this program. Why does this keep opening? This is annoying. So open with, and I'm going to choose Flash Player. There we go. So this is what that, and you can see what I mean about the reversal. So it's scaling over to this side and changing shape, and then it's bouncing back again because I did that duplicate of the frames and then reversed it. Again, this is animating at 12 frames per second, so it's a little bit choppy. If I wanted it to be smoother, I could do it at 24 frames per second, but I would need to have twice as many frames. So twice as much work, twice as many drawings, and so on. So if you want to limit the amount of frames, you could do it as 12 frames per second. Also, most of the time in animation, even though they animate 24 frames per second, animators do what they call animating on twos, which means they do one drawing, and then they let that drawing stay there for two frames, and then they'll do the next drawing. So in effect, what I'm doing by exporting this as 12 frames per second is simply animating on twos. But to really have it animate on twos, basically what I would do is duplicate each of those frames, and then it would play at half the speed. So if I wanted to slow this down, I could duplicate it. Then it would be animating on twos, but I would have a smoother animation, and it would be a little bit slower. So I'm going to go over that in a little bit more detail in next week's class. We're going to look at taking stuff from Illustrator and then importing it into Animate so that you can make a more sophisticated animation. So this is really just to kind of get you interested in the idea that for the Instagram ad, you could maybe incorporate animation. And the animation could be very, very, very simple. It could simply be that the type, enlarges a little bit or bounces onto the screen, or it might be that you have, like, as part of the idea that the whole poster kind of builds, like the lettering slides in from the top, and then there's the illustration kind of gradually gets drawn out frame by frame in the main central area. You can explore that how you want to, if you feel. It's not a requirement of the project, by the way, that you incorporate animation into it. It's just an interesting opportunity for you to try and play around with this if it's something that interests you. And then also, if you wanted to, as an extra credit assignment later in the semester, you could create a very short animation to turn in as extra credit. You can only do one extra credit in the course, by the way. So you could do designing a font, remember? I've given you that one as an option. And then you could also do a short animated little piece of animation as an extra credit assignment. All right, does anybody have questions on what we've covered so far? I think I've covered everything that I want to cover in today's class. So just a reminder, there's some links on the handout for today's class, which were on last week's handout, actually. So these are all related to the poster project that you're working on. There's the AIGA.org vote. That link is to the American Institute of Graphic Arts organization, where they have the vote competition where this project is drawn from. And then we also have the vote411.org, which is a place we can find information about voting. Then there's typography.com. That's the website for Hoffler and Company, the type designers. Then there's KernType, which is that game where you can play around with kerning type and get scores. And then 15 top typographic resources is a blog post, which gives you some useful areas where you can look for typography. And then on the next page of the handout, there's the description for the project. Make sure you read the description, because oftentimes I have students turn in projects which don't really quite meet the requirements of what I'm actually asking for. So make sure you read over it. And then there's some examples, which are the same ones that are on the handout from last week's class. These are meant just as inspiration. So I don't want you to copy these in any way, but by all means use these as inspiration for ideas. You know, look at what other people have done previously and see if that allows you to come up with something new. You may take something that's already been done and rework it and do something completely different from it, but it's a starting point. It shouldn't be something that you copy from, okay? And then the last thing I wanted to say is what I would like to do, if anybody's interested in doing it, is just have you guys show what you've done so far on the poster, and then we can critique it as a group briefly. So let me stop sharing for a second. I know, Chris, you've done quite a bit on your poster project already, right?
It's uploaded to Canva.
You have it on Canvas. So I'm going to start with Chris's.
But it's only in black and white.
That's okay. That's
I didn't finish one. There's still another work to do.
Let me change the name of this because it's a little bit confusing. So I have it set as promotional campaign right now, but remember that this is the poster project. So I'm going to call it Get Out the Vote Poster. I used to, in previous semesters, I had done this project slightly differently, where it was an event. Sometimes it was the LA Marathon, for instance. And I just felt like it didn't seem really relevant to do that at this time. And because the election's coming up, I felt like the Get Out the Vote poster would be a better solution. So this is the same project, okay? I've just changed the name at the top here. It's changed everywhere else, but I hadn't realized I hadn't changed it there. Okay, so this is Chris's. I'm going to download it so that we can look at it a little bit better.
It is a lot of work.
So Chris has got several ideas. This is the first one. I kind of like the black-white sort of yin-yang thing. It's like the two-party system. So you have it in black and white right now. Did you imagine converting it to color, Christopher?
Can you share your screen, Professor?
Oh, I'm not showing it?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to add color.
I thought I was sharing it, sorry. So you can see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So your intention was to use the red and blue and white?
Correct, yes.
Okay. I do like it in black and white. Do you like it in black and white?
I actually prefer black and white.
Yeah.
There's more impacted.
Yeah, and those political posters are always red, white, and blue as well.
Yeah.
There's something really nice about the simplicity of the black and white on here. One thing I would say about it. Oh, actually, maybe I should have other people comment first. Does anybody else have comments before I say anything?
My issue was, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Maybe just a suggestion, to make the check mark stand out, to not have it divide black and white. Maybe just choose a solid, like one color, like how John said, red.
Oh yeah, okay. That's an interesting point. So just have that one element, have the color, and have that be like red.
Okay.
Okay. So that's that was one thing. One suggestion I have, Christopher, on this one is that with the word vote, because you've got it so large at the top of the page, that I think that you want to put the spacing a little bit closer together on all of those letters.
That's the trouble I was having, was trying to cover each letter.
Uh-huh.
I was just trying to, I was having a real hard time with that.
Is that because of how it fits in with the division in the middle, or just technically you're having a hard time kerning it?
Or just because of the division of the middle.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can see what you mean. I still think that you could probably kern them closer together though and enlarge them, and you'd still end up with the division basically being in the same place. Because you have pretty even spacing between them. It's not like you have to kern them. It's more like tracking, actually.
Right,
what you want to do is track the spacing closer together.
Okay.
I like this one. I like the simplicity of it. It's very straightforward and direct and to the point. All right, the next one. Do you have anything you want to say about this one, Chris?
This one I fixed the hand. I like this one.
Yeah.
Pretty simple, straightforward. I think that it would be better if this was up here in color to make all the elements stand out.
Oh, it's okay. Oh, that's why. It's because my video was off. I was wondering why I couldn't see you guys. I was going to ask somebody. I couldn't see who was here. So I'm going to ask somebody else to critique it. Ingrid, what do you think about this one? You have any suggestions? Are you there, Ingrid? Or what about Clifford? Clifford, are you there?
I can critique it, Professor.
Okay.
I really do like it. I like that.
I can only see your picture right now. I can't see your name, but this is.
Oh, this is Denise. Sorry.
Denise. Okay, yeah.
I like that it's very centered.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like maybe the hand needs to, like the outlining of the hand needs to be a little thicker to match maybe the box.
Yeah, I agree with you. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, you're right.
Yeah, besides that, it all looks really great. Yeah, it looks really great. And I was gonna say maybe for the first one, there was like a line in the box.
Mm-hmm.
On the left side, the white box.
Yeah.
There's a black line, so maybe there'll be a white line on the other side of it.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I looked at that line and I thought it was funny, but I couldn't really kind of think what to say about it. But I think that is the point, it's missing it on the other side, isn't it?
Yeah, but these are all really great. Like these are
the other thing on this one, Chris, is that the slot is the same. It doesn't get divided there. Maybe it should be solid black on the white side.
Okay. Thank you, Denise.
I agree with Denise about the thickness of the line. I think it could even be thicker than the one on the box, and the box could be thicker as well. So those should be the same, I think.
Okay.
The box also, maybe it isn't a line around the outside. Maybe it's a different color.
Okay.
The other thing is that the hand could be distinguished by the background color, actually, and then it doesn't need a stroke around the outside at all. And same with the box, actually. So maybe you don't need the stroke around. It could just all be shapes. You know, so if let's say in the background you had a sky color, and then the hand, if it was white, would stand out against that automatically. You know, you wouldn't need to have a stroke which separates it. But I like the idea of this. I like the way that the flag becomes the ballot. The only other comment I have on this one is take a look at the typography. And again, I would have the spacing on the word vote a little bit closer together. And then this is an example of where you could do that block thing that I was talking about earlier, where you have the type all, so the word do your part, you've made that a little bit bigger so that it's the same length as an American.
Okay.
And then make the word vote the same width as those so that everything is the same width. So you have everything centered, but everything is also just like a block, you know?
Okay.
I like the way you've created the hierarchy with the word vote being in the bold and a bigger size. So that works well. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Denise.
This one I like as well for the simplicity of it. I think if you have like a really strong color, this was the one that I had kind of shown earlier in the class with an orange background, because we had sort of talked about this in our one-on-one meeting, right? And although it's ridiculously simple, there's something really nice about that, particularly with a really strong, vibrant color behind it. It kind of grabs your attention.
Professor,
Uh-huh.
I was thinking, for example, let's say if I put the background like a blue color and the typeface vote, I could put the letters red or white.
Yes, you could do, absolutely, yeah. So you could do one like this, actually. Let me show you on my screen. Where's that example? Oh, that one. So you were talking about like this background would be blue, right?
And it's in blue.
And then the lettering here would be red and white.
Yeah, red, white, red, white.
Yeah.
And then we could have the date in black, kept in black. Like December 3rd, 2020 in black.
Yeah.
Something like that. That would play around with it.
It's something like that kind of thing, right? Is that what you were talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I do like this one. I think there's something really nice about the simplicity of it. Maybe have it the other way, so the check mark gets the red, so there's a little bit more emphasis.
Okay. All right, yes, okay.
But yeah, I kind of like that idea. I think it's pretty good. Or alternately is you could do this red, and then this could be the blue, and then if you did these white, then it's sort of reminiscent of the American flag in a way, because you've got the blue in the top on this side, and then you've got the white, kind of like the stripes. You could even extend, like, this is just something that kind of popped into my head, but if you would extend these off the end of the page, you then have the stripes and the flag kind of created by the E.
Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah, I like that. I like that idea.
All right, very good. Let me go back to your project.
Should have one more.
Yeah. So actually you got two more, I think. There's this one, and then you've got this one.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm not sure about
Let's
that
stay
one.
with this one first.
I'm still working on
What do you think about this one, Denise?
I love the font a lot. It's it kind of reminds me, not in a bad way, but like of Halloween, just because it looks very like I don't know what it is, but it kind of reminds me.
It looks, there is I know what you mean. I think it's because the type is, that sort of style of type is oftentimes used for Halloween because it's almost like shaking, right? Like,
Yes, shaking. Exactly. That's the word I was looking for. It looks like it's shaking.
Yeah, and then I think also that the style of the illustration, you know, because the hand reaching up is kind of like reminiscent of those horror movies where like somebody reaches out of the ground or something, you know?
Yes, this is probably why I had this in my head.
Yeah, I can totally understand that, yeah.
Yeah.
This was actually, I think, you had an idea about this one last time we spoke, hadn't you? And we talked about it a little bit, Chris.
Yes.
And we talked about the illustration. I think the way that you did the illustration looks really good. I really like it.
Thank you.
I get what who was it that was saying it? Was that Denise that was saying? That was Denise, right? That was talking about it looking like horror.
Yes, that was
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can understand Denise's point about it looking like a horror movie, but I still kind of like this idea. I think it's kind of a nice idea. Your vote shall set. I love the sentence. Your vote shall set you free. It should be you free, right?
Yes, sorry.
Free.
Yes,
It's pretty powerful. It's pretty powerful, Chris. It's really
Yeah. Yeah, it feels powerful to me too. It's a strong image. And then this is the last one. This is your vote is the key to open your rights as an American to democracy.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this one.
The sentence, I think, is too complicated there for one thing, Chris. So maybe you could simplify this. Your vote is the key
to democracy.
Or maybe this should be like, maybe you should have like a headline, your vote is the key. And then maybe underneath you could have a smaller piece of text where once somebody's drawn somebody in with that idea, they could then read about the way that, you know, voting opens up your rights as an American to democracy. Or, you know, you could have like a more complex idea afterwards. But I think to begin with, you need something which is a headline, which is a simple one-liner. Your vote.
It could also be the last phrase he used, your vote shall set you free.
Mm-hmm. So you have like the small text first, you mean?
No, like using the same quote since it's like a log and your vote's going to set you free.
So open your rights as an American to democracy and then your vote is the key. Is that what you mean?
No, I kind of mean like replacing the whole quote for the last one he used.
Oh, just having your vote is the key?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right. Does anybody else have comments? Okay. Does anybody else want to have one of their projects critiqued or have their project critiqued, I should say?
Thank you guys very much.
You're doing great, Chris. They're looking really good.
Oh, I have.
Is that Jonathan or Nathan?
No, it's Nathan.
Hi, Nathan.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do we need to make multiple posters for the assignment?
So, as far as the requirement for the project is, you're creating one poster which is 11 by 17, and then you're creating an ad which is an Instagram ad. So that's 1080 by 1080. So it's a square format. So what I'm asking you to do is to take that poster you've already designed and then reformat it into a square format. And then also don't forget that with the Instagram one, if you want to push yourself a little bit further, you could also try making a simple animated version of it. So that's not a requirement, but if you wanted to do it just for fun or for, you know, like to push yourself a little bit further, you could try animating it. Also, don't forget that with Instagram, if you wanted to, you could break up the ad into a series of slides that they could present on Instagram. So, you know, like on Instagram, you can look at, or you can sort of thumb through images that people have posted. So you could have your ad set up in such a way that there's one image and then they slide through and then there's another image and it builds the story of what the ad is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Chris has done several versions, and this is a good approach to design, always. When you're designing things, is to do one design and then duplicate it and make changes to it, or come up with several ideas, more importantly. Come up with different ideas and try them out and see which one you think works best. And then when we're doing the critique, if you want to present several versions, in a real world situation, we quite oftentimes will present more than one design to a client. so that we can have a discussion about them. So if you did one design, you present it to the client and they go, no, I really don't like that, then that's kind of the end of the conversation to some extent. Whereas if you do, say, 3 or 4 versions and present them, then you can have a discussion. Well, we like this second one, but we kind of like the color of the first one. And then you can talk about it and you can decide what would make it the best version of the project. So it's, you know, design is oftentimes collaborative in that way, whether it's you working with other people in a team, but also you working with the client to define exactly what's the best way to approach communicating the message you're trying to communicate. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
So it's a good idea to try different versions, in other words. All right, does anybody else have something that they want to present and we can critique right now, or do you guys want to wait until next week and do a full critique next week? Michelle, do you have anything you want to present right now?
No, I don't have anything right now.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to take off. I have a lab from 1 to 3, which is an open Zoom like I normally do. So if you guys need any help and you want to come in and get some individual help, I'll be there. And let me just take a screen capture to see who's still here. Hang on 1 second. Can you guys all turn off the video for a second so all I see is your name? All right, that's it. Okay, see you guys. Have a good weekend. And as I said, if you want to come in and annoy me this afternoon, I'll be around from 1 to 3. Okay.
This afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Professor.
See you later.
See ya.